Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking to Dr. Bret Collier. Bret is a professor of wildlife ecology at Louisiana State University. He specializes in studying wild turkeys. Hi, Bret. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Oh, hi. I'm glad to be here today. I hope everybody's having a great day today. I'm sitting in my office in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at Louisiana State University, watching the various warblers and vireos that are migrating through right now in the trees outside the window. So it's a pretty good day today. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, yes. It's an awesome day today. And this is going to be a really fun conversation because turkeys are such interesting birds with a pretty complicated history, actually. And I've found that a lot of people don't know that much about our wild turkeys. So I'm excited to get to dig into this a little bit with you and talk to you about them today. But before we really get started, let's take a couple of minutes and just tell everybody a little bit about what you do and who you are.
Sure. So my name is Bret Collier. I am a professor in the School of Renewable Natural Resources at Louisiana State University. So I'm down here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I'm a wildlife biologist by trade. My training is in wildlife biology, ecology, and management. I did my doctoral work at the University of Arkansas, and I've been at Louisiana State University for going on about 9 years right now. And before I was at LSU, I was a researcher at Texas A&M University. And while I work on a lot of different things, as most professors do, predominantly what I study are game species, things like deer, turkeys, quail, waterfowl, those type of wildlife. But my passion is really in the wild turkey. And I've been studying the wild turkey for almost 2 decades continuously as an academic here at LSU and at Texas A&M. I'm pretty engaged in the outreach side of conservation. I spend a lot of time trying to get science across to the layperson who maybe doesn't have a chance or an opportunity to talk to a scientist every day. And then I teach a lot. I teach mainly seniors here at LSU just because of what classes I engage in. But I teach classes like our management techniques class, which the kids call it the jumping on it class, because I teach them what we use to catch animals. And just as a for instance, this weekend, I'm taking about 24 seniors to South Texas to go support another university on a big deer research project capture operation with helicopters and nets and all kinds of jazz. So yes, it's the jumping on it class is what we call it. And then I teach kind of our natural resource policy and law class, which is a class where we talk about environmental policy, how it impacts wildlife conservation, how it impacts land conservation. And I do a lot of, civics work with the students. Then we bring in a lot of people from state and local government, from the administration and the Louisiana government to talk about the various policy implications here, because like Louisiana, one of our biggest concerns is our coastline, because we're losing several hundred football fields every day of coast due to erosion in Louisiana. So it's good for the students to kind of hear about all the policy questions that come up whenever you're trying to maintain one of the largest and most productive coastlines in the United States. So, and then I suppose on top of that, I'm a dad. I got a cute little daughter named Kennedy, and my partner Reagan is a federal scientist that works on water quality issues and harmful algae. So we're kind of fairly well rounded. And I'm looking forward to the discussion about turkeys today. So.
Oh, yes. And yes, I remember fondly management and techniques classes, and policy classes weren't really as interesting. But now that I've been in the field and in my career for a while, I'm realizing that was really a very important class. And having that
Yes,
background is so great.
you are absolutely right. And what we jokingly say is that wildlife biologists don't actually manage wildlife; we manage people. And that is very true. I would like to think that I'm doing everything I can to manage wild turkeys and threatened and endangered species and all that stuff. But really, what I'm doing is I'm studying those so that we can help manage people a little bit better and how they use and relate to natural resources and the environment. So, but it's a lot of fun, and it's good to have the opportunity to kind of teach both sides of the equation, which is why I really like my job down here. So,
yes, that's the same line that I heard when I was in classes too, many years ago. But
probably not as long ago as me. It's been a long time since I've been in classes.
Been a long time for me too.
Okay. We'll just both assume that we're 30. How about that? We'll go with that today.
I like that idea. So you said you've been studying turkey. Turkeys were like your big thing, and you've been studying them. How did you get interested in them?
Oh, it's a really good story. So when I was doing my PhD, I was studying white-tailed deer. I've always had an affinity for math. I really liked mathematics, and being able to merge kind of math and biology was something that I always wanted to do. And at the time I was coming through my doctoral research, deer was a real big issue. Deer restoration, impacts of harvest, and those kind of things was something everybody was interested in. But the problem is everybody was interested in it. So everybody wanted to be a deer biologist. And I have some great friends that are professional deer biologists now. And I liked working on deer, but I wasn't passionate about deer. I like deer hunting, and I should probably state I'm an avid outdoor recreation person, ranging from hiking and bird watching to hunting and fishing. So I might reference hunting as part of this, or bird watching through here. So I do it all. And I had a colleague, a professor at Texas A&M named Nova Silvey. He's retired now, but he and I would always interact at meetings together. And I went to him because he had a long history studying upland game birds. And I saw professionally that that's kind of what I enjoyed hunting. I enjoyed looking at, I enjoyed studying. That I said, Nova, I'd like to finish my PhD and come and work for you at Texas A&M. And Nova said, well, I don't have anything, but this other awesome professor, a guy named Marcus Peterson, who now is at University of Texas, El Paso, has a position for a postdoc, which is basically a scientist that comes in for a couple of years and after their PhD and does science just all day long, managing graduate student, and kind of learns to be a professor, right? It's kind of like an apprenticeship, like a professor apprenticeship. So I went to work for Marcus running a turkey project in Central Texas. And, you find what you're good at, sometimes fortuitously. And I was working with some great graduate students, Kyle and Justin, and we had a really good success on that project. And then Texas Parks and Wildlife said, hey, you guys did a great job. We'd like for you to do some more. And would you like to stick around and do some more work? And I said, yes, because that's what you do when you're a scientist, is you never say no. So I said yes. And then I started doing a lot of work with Texas Parks and Wildlife in Texas when I was at Texas A&M. And I worked pretty much exclusively on Rio Grande wild turkeys, which is one of the subspecies of wild turkeys, while I was in Texas. And then started to dabble working with some colleagues on Eastern wild turkeys. And probably what really, for me, made the full leap into turkeys was we had a technological shift. And it won't, to people who listen to this podcast, they won't maybe recognize it, but there was a time without Google Maps. And there was a time where people didn't have iPhones, that they could open up where they were at on Google Maps, and there was a dot where they were. During what we'll call the prehistoric era, when you'd go to chase a turkey around, you'd have to go out, it would carry a little backpack on its back. And the backpack would emit a beep that you could only hear with the receiver. It's called telemetry. And we track these turkeys around with antennas and driving trucks and use that information to figure out where they nested and all of that kind of stuff to understand their biology, basically. How many eggs are they laying? How many babies? How many nests are hatching? Those sorts of things. Well, in about 2008, we had or 2008, 2009, there was kind of a technological revolution in that we managed to put a GPS unit inside of a backpack that a turkey could carry because it has to be small. So think a couple of things of like chapstick is the example I give people, right? If you held two of them together in your fingers, right, it has to be about that big. It's got to collect, but it's got to be able to collect data that tells you where the turkey goes. And by doing that, instead of getting 1 point every 3 or 4 days, we were able to get 20 or 30 locations every day. That changed almost everything we thought we knew about turkey biology. And my friend Chris Kohani, who's with Petronics Aerospace out of Germany, is a telemetry manufacturer. He and I built this original tag and put it on a hen in Texas and got like 400 locations. And we were ecstatic because most theses at that time used like 200 locations. So we were just, oh my goodness. And that opened up and blossomed into a massive scientific awakening where all of a sudden we didn't have to follow the birds as regularly, but we could also still get really cool behavioral information, movement information, where the birds were moving, whenever they were nesting, whenever they had poults, what kind of vegetation they used, how they responded to things like land management practices, such as timber harvest and fire, what impacts environmental issues had on them, like temperature or weather. And it really kind of allowed us to broaden our perspective. So back in the prehistoric, before iPhones and everything, we didn't have that ability. And as we've progressed kind of through science, we're asking probably, I don't want to say we're asking different questions. We're asking and answering some of the same questions better now, which is helping us make better decisions for the management of the species as a whole. And that's been kind of I suppose if I have a role in turkey ecology, that's kind of been it, is, trying to focus on what we can do to better work with our state wildlife agency partners all across the United States to support conservation and management of turkeys. So that's kind of how I got here.
Yes, I remember chasing songbirds and bats around with the telemetry equipment very well.
Yes, and it's a lot of effort. Yes, and it's a huge amount of effort to just track one bird 3 days a week, drive wherever the bird is, hop out, triangulate onto it, figure out where it's at, leave and go to the next one. Now we can track birds, just check and see if they're alive and know that we get all their movement and spatial information and behavioral information from the tags that we put on them. It's really a technological leap. And I mean, I was joking with my partner 2 days ago. We were watching TV and a commercial came on for a foldable phone with a screen that like an iPhone screen, but you could fold it. And I was like, I already had a Nokia flip phone. I don't need to go back. I thought we were transferring farther forward than that. So that's kind of how I ended up here. And I'd be remiss not to mention that within all of that work, it wasn't just me. There's a huge suite of 20 or so graduate students that I worked with, and 50 or 60 undergraduate students and hundreds of field technicians that have worked with me. So everything we kind of talk about today, like we all jokingly say, I'm the guy that pays the bills and makes sure everything ends up in the right spot. I don't actually get to do the field science as much anymore. So kind of all the turkey science we'll talk about today will be off of their backs, and I'm just kind of the conduit to get it out to the listeners today.
Oh, yes, that is always the case. But just to make sure that everyone is kind of on the same page and to get this out of the way, because you did mention Rio Grande subspecies, you mentioned Eastern subspecies, but before we get to that, because I do want to talk about the subspecies a little bit, what's the difference between our wild turkeys and the domestic turkeys that many people are much more familiar with?
Sure. So wild turkeys and domestic turkeys have some common ancestral lineages, right? The domestic turkeys generally that we see, they're all typically what's called the genus is Meliacris, okay? And that's what your domestic turkeys are. But domestic turkeys are bred, and I'm not going to get into the genetic breakdowns or anything like that. But so domestic turkeys are bred to have large breast meat. That's what they're made for. They're not bred to be able to run anywhere. They're basically bred with each other to produce meat, and that's kind of their focus. They're also they have lost over time color in a lot of cases. Their body feathers are often white. There are some various breeds that have black and gray and everything, but they've lost kind of the coloration that we see in all of our wild turkeys. They can't fly very often or very well, and that's because their body mass is so much heavier than, you'll have a domestic turkey that you can buy at whatever grocery store, it'll be 20 pounds or 22 pounds or 16 pounds cleaned. Mm-hmm. Whenever most of our wild birds, our wild females may fall in the 9 to 12 range, and maybe up to 13 or 14, and a fully grown adult male may not clear 20 most of the time.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's like as the whole bird. That's
as a whole bird. Yeah. Feathers and
dressed
everything.
in the freezer.
Not clean dressed. Yeah. Significantly smaller. But there's subspecies of wild turkeys in the United States. So you've got, and just so we're all everybody's on the same page. Mm-hmm. In the eastern United States, and you could generally think kind of Minnesota, Great Plains South, basically where the timber ends east of there, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. That's predominantly going to be your eastern wild turkey. And that's the most ubiquitous species. It's the most abundant species we've got in the United States. Down in Florida, if you imagine you kind of drew a line across Florida, maybe around a little north of Tampa area, maybe a little bit higher than that, you have what's called the Florida wild turkey, or the Osceola. That's a subspecies. They're typically, and I should say all subspecies historically have been separated based on morphological characteristics, kind of what their feathers look like. And we won't get into too much detail on that today because, we're talking. When you get into the plains regions of the United States, predominantly what you have in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas are the Rio Grande subspecies of wild turkey. And then as you get out into the mountainous, kind of the Rockies, the Front Range, some in the Dakotas right now, you have what's the Merriam's subspecies. Then down in the far kind of southern region of Arizona and over into the southwest corner of New Mexico in what are called the Sky Island complexes, you have the Gould's wild turkey. And then there is also kind of what you get into the Yucatan region. There's the ocellated wild turkey, it's very beautiful. And if the listeners are on here, Google ocellated wild turkey. They're absolutely gorgeous birds.
Oh yeah.
And then they're beautiful. And then there is a species that we think is extinct. That's the Mexican wild turkey, which exists typically in the highland regions of Mexico. There's been some discussions on whether or not people are getting photographs of Mexican wild turkeys or, Goulds or some other, local domestics down there, but we think it's extinct. And those are the various subspecies, and they're widespread. Turkeys exist in 49 of 50 states right now. They don't exist in Alaska, and they do exist in Hawaii. People are like, how did turkey fly there? They didn't fly there. They were taken there.
They were introduced.
They were taken there. But we do have turkeys in basically all the lower 48 and Hawaii. And not to diverge here, but that's turkey restoration. Restoration of the wild turkey is probably, if not, it is. It's probably the best example of species restoration that the United States has to offer. It's probably the most successful example because there was a time in the early to mid 1900s where the wild turkey was almost extirpated from the country. Mm-hmm. There were not, and I don't want to overrun you here. Tell me if you want me to keep going.
Oh, no, this is exactly what we were going into next because people don't know that conservation story. And we need to know the conservation story.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad to tell it. So a lot of people, let me take a step to the side here. A lot of people will probably have seen at some point that Benjamin Franklin said that the wild turkey should be the national bird, right? And that's actually not what he said. What he actually did was he wrote a letter to his sister, I think it was, or his niece. And basically it said, the eagle is effectively a carrion eater and is scared of everything, and that the wild turkey and talking about the one in his yard was bold and would charge you, and that's a strong and a proud bird. I think he called it a bird of honor or something along those lines. And so the wild turkey's been around since the founding of our country. And with the onset of market hunting in the 1800s, and then we saw concomitant with that in the early 1900s, the Industrial Revolution, we saw widespread declines in wild turkeys all across the United States. And there were only a few kind of strongholds left. And these were typically in places where people either didn't go or there were large landowners. You can think like the Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina. Always had remnant populations of wild turkeys. Southern Florida, once you get down towards northern boundaries of the Everglades, always had a few wild turkeys. Texas, Central Texas and South Texas, always had a few wild turkeys. And then some of the mountainous regions in the Arizona, New Mexico. We're not talking widespread. We're talking from the millions that we have now to under 100,000, if not fewer.
Yeah, very isolated populations too.
Yes,
that.
And there was a lot of concern that extirpation was going to be a problem. So, in combination with hunting regulation kind of reduction, so they started to impact the take and how many were harvested. In the 60s, we had this technological advance, I'll call it, where we learned how to use rocket nets. So we got really good at shooting nets over birds. And before that time, people had tried to kind of restore turkeys by raising them on farms and then releasing them out into the wild. And that never works.
No.
They don't have the instinct. They just die. And it's never been successful in tens of thousands of attempts. So they started to take wild stocked birds. And this would be, and when I say they, I should back up. So state wildlife agencies are responsible for the mandate of managing wildlife within their states. The National Wild Turkey Federation was going to have its 50th anniversary this next year, which was started in, I think, 73. So yeah, that'd be 50 years in 23. The National Wild Turkey Federation started in the 70s, and they were kind of the supporting conduit to assist states with translocating wildlife, turkeys in this case, over state boundaries, such that they could support restoration. And so all the state agencies that you can think of, everything from your Tennessee and Kentucky's and Georgia's and South Carolina's to your Texas's and Utah's and Nebraska's, all work together to catch wild birds where wild birds were, I'll call it abundant, but locally abundant, and take them to places where there weren't turkeys. And what happened then is wild turkey populations just exploded. They were put into these areas where there were no birds. There was no competition for resources. Predator communities were fairly low, and the birds just made a whole bunch of babies. It was the easiest way to explain it. They made a whole bunch of babies, and then the scientists, the state agency wildlife biologists, would go in and catch some and move them around. And this restoration or restocking effort is the reason that we have turkeys in all 49 states right now. Most states are generally dominated by one subspecies. So I'll take my home state of Illinois just as an example. Illinois has eastern wild turkeys in it.
Yeah.
There's no other subspecies of turkey in Illinois. It has easterns. Other states, due to kind of restoration activities, may have a mixture. Nebraska is a good example. Nebraska, probably has eastern wild turkeys on the eastern portion of Nebraska. And then there's probably a mix of Rios that come in from the south, from Kansas, and Sumeriums that were put over there in the west. But if you're in South Carolina, North Carolina, Delaware, Massachusetts, Maine, the turkeys you've got in that kind of region are all the eastern wild turkeys. The good news is state agencies were really really well thought out, and you don't want to, what's the word I'm looking for? Genetically mix some of your unique subspecies. So we never put something like a Rio Grande wild turkey where a Gould's was. Because, so we never did any restoration like that. They were only put to what was expected to be kind of their native range. And just for the listeners, just so you all know, I mean, wild turkey restoration is the national success story. There has never been a single species in the United States that has had a distinct, definitive restoration program that has taken a species from the near point of extirpation within their range to hugely abundant. In most cases, over a long time period. Now we are seeing some changes in turkey populations now, but the restoration story of the wild turkey is probably the success story in the U.S.
Yeah, I would definitely have it within the top 3, probably within the top 2.
Yeah.
With it. And it's not one that, like I said, most people know, because most people today have grown up with turkeys everywhere.
Sure, I get phone calls every once in a while. I get a phone call or an email. It's always from Boston. I don't know what it is from people in the suburbs, Boston. So if there's anybody out there, it's you all. Okay. The turkeys are roosting on my house or the tree above my car or on my car. What do I do? Well, there was a time there weren't turkeys there. So we see turkeys that walking around, and, they'll pop up and show up in downtowns of big cities and whatnot. And they're more a forest dwelling bird, but I always get the biggest kick out of people calling me is like, what do I do with all these turkeys? You always see the videos in the spring of a turkey attacking somebody's tire because they see the reflection in the rims. But there was a chance, and I guess this is the point to take home. Like so many of the problems that we have in the conservation of wildlife within the United States, there was a chance we could have lost this species forever. Right. And I think this past week, the Fish and Wildlife Service listed around 30 species as extinct in the United States, just on their kind of weekly update, like, from the, taking them from near threatened or extirpated to truly extinct. And there was a time that the wild turkey was actually on that path. And we're fortunate that we were able to kind of right the ship and change direction on that, such that we can have, turkeys roosting in trees in somebody's yard in Boston, or roosting out behind my house, or, all the other benefits that we get from them. So yeah, it's quite a success story.
Yes, it is. Which you also kind of alluded to something else I wanted to talk about, because despite it being such a success story, we're starting to see some declines, especially in the southeastern states with the populations. Can you talk about that a little bit? But
sure.
When you do, define southeastern, because I know like Louisiana, Georgia, okay, those are obviously southeastern. But when you get to like Kentucky, Tennessee, yeah, we're considered southeastern, but the ecology.
Certainly. So the easiest way to explain it is that animal populations grow until they hit some kind of restricting factor, some resource that's limited, and then they kind of flatten out, right? Human populations, because of technology, we tend to always grow. We have more babies, our survival rates are higher, we have medicine, we have doctors and all that kind of stuff. People live longer now. It doesn't work that way with animals, right? Animals don't have doctors, so they can't extend their longevity at all. So once they reach a point where some factor might limit them, whether that factor is natural mortality, human-based mortality, landscape change and fragmentation, environmental change, or whatever, they grow, and then they reach an apex or a top, and then they start to drop off. So immediately post restoration, turkeys were in a huge phase of growth, is the easiest way to explain it. I mean, rapid population increases, turkeys all over the place. And then they stabilized in the early 2000s is what we roughly think. We saw populations get, fairly stable. And then since about, probably about 06 or 07, we started to see a little bit of a decline in turkey populations in the Southeast. Now, the Southeast, basically, there's what I'll call biological boundaries. And then there's like the true Southeast. So the true Southeast would basically be, think East Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, straight across to kind of North South Carolina. But from a turkey management perspective, kind of our southeastern region also includes Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, all the way up into the Virginias. And we don't keep anybody out. Indiana, they pop in occasionally. Illinois pops in occasionally because not all of our states are boxes, right?
Right.
East Texas is involved. Oklahoma pops in because they have Easterns, and predominantly the southeastern group is focused on eastern wild turkeys. Well, the reason I brought up the restoration point is that the Southeast was where the earliest restoration occurred. So what's happening in the Southeast may be a harbinger for what is coming for some of the populations across the rest of the United States. I know that the turkey biologist, Mary Jo up in Pennsylvania, has already started to note some declines up there. I know that they're doing some research. I know Maine has been doing some research of the same concern. So the concern is, in the Southeast particularly, but also nationally, is that we're starting to see declines in wild turkey abundance and population size. And some of those declines are likely driven in reduced reproduction. So we're not making as many baby wild turkeys as we used to make. And generally speaking, in a species that's not hunted recreationally, we would not have that kind of data because we typically don't monitor unhunted species as intensely or at a national level as we do our hunted species, like deer and ducks and turkeys and quail and squirrels and that kind of stuff. So we had a lot of information, and it's not just me. There's a lot of scientists, a lot of state agency biologists that work on these issues. But there's some concern in our kind of tight-knit turkey biologist community that we're seeing declines. And everybody is, especially in the Southeast, is starting to see the same decline. What's tricky about it is that turkey hunting activity or the engagement of the hunting community is at an apex. It's very high right now. And we have lots of turkey hunters. They're the second most hunted big game species in the United States behind white-tailed deer. They're hugely popular. And, as a state agency biologist and both as a researcher, you're trying to find that active balance between population sustainability of a recreationally used resource and the ability for hunters, who are really the engine of conservation because of the time and money they, for licenses and stamps and, land management that they often do, they're the engine. How do we reach a balance? And what we've seen over the last, say, 15 years is slight, but fairly steady declines in productivity. And concomitant with that, we've also seen declines in the number of turkeys harvested in a lot of states. Turkey hunting used to be a fall sport. It was, people would go out and hunt turkeys with dogs. The dogs don't chase the turkeys around. That's not my intent, right? It's not like, dogs chasing rabbits. It's more like they would go out and they would use the dogs to break up flocks. And then they'd call kind of use a comeback and a get back together call to bring the flocks back in. And that's how you used to hunt turkeys. And we've transitioned from a fall kind of focused hunting season to a spring hunting season. And some of us scientists think that may be causing some issues in that hunters, as a general rule, this is not a criticism because I am one, hunters as a general rule want to hunt as early as possible because they want to be out in the woods doing the sport that they love. And I'm the same way. So I am the glass house. There's no throwing stones here. But they also want to have maximum opportunity. And what's funny, and just for all the listeners, what gets a turkey hunter going it has nothing to do with shooting the turkey. Okay. It really doesn't. It has to do with being out in the woods in the morning when the sun's coming up and you're by yourself and there's nobody there, but the birds are tweeting and the frogs. And then all of a sudden, through the oaks or the pines or down the riparian corridor, this booming gobble lights up the morning sky from a male gobbler up in a tree, just sounding off to everybody in the neighborhood, hey, I'm here. And if you ask any turkey hunter to a person, that's what we go to the woods for. It has nothing to do with shooting the bird. It's knowing that the bird was there and knowing that there was an opportunity to hear that bird and interact with that bird. That's what makes a hunt good, right? Mm-hmm. That said, we all like to shoot turkeys too. And some of our concern from a scientific perspective with the decline is socio-politically, hunting seasons have got earlier and earlier every year. They are to the point now in some states where hunting activity for males occurs before what we call the peak of nesting or the peak of incubation. So we have some concerns that we're losing our males before they're able to breed our females. And the reason these concerns exist has to do with the sociology and the behavior of the actual turkey. So not to get too sciencey, I'll try to keep it at a pretty comfortable level, but female wild turkeys select what male they want to reproduce with.
Right.
And once they've selected a male, that's who they breed with before their first nesting attempt. Now, there might be extracopulatory activities while they're laying because the concept of sperm mixing and fitness is useful in all animals. But once they picked a male, that's who they're going to breed with. If he's removed, it's not like there's a ladder and she just drops down to the next male that's in the area. She may have to kind of search or find a different male that she finds acceptable. And this is the behavioral side of it. And if she doesn't find a different male, she might not breed. So historically, turkey management is focused on ensuring that all the females have the opportunity to breed before hunting seasons have opened. And we try to time our hunting seasons in line with kind of the peak of incubation, right? The peak of nesting. And we've gotten away from that a little bit due to sociology, political pressure, just, changes in seasons so that people can have opportunity earlier. We are seeing a lot of changes right now at a lot of states that are moving their seasons a little bit later to try and address that problem. I mean, my state of Louisiana has been pretty proactive on that and have had some success to where we open later. But it's not just hunting, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to be clear to everybody, that's just the first thing. Over the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen massive changes in our landscape dynamic that these birds exist in. For easterns being the primary example, eastern wild turkeys, they're forested birds, right? Sylvestris means forested, right? And, we're losing forest constantly to both anthropogenic impacts of timber harvest and that kind of stuff, but also to disease of our trees. We're also dealing with increased human population that extends out into suburbia. And everybody wants to live in nature, but nobody likes nature sometimes, especially when it, roosts above their car. But we're also dealing with, broad scale changes in climate that are adjusting issues like green up and insect availability, which is a primary nutrients for our poults. And to top it all off, we've actually had evidence of occurrence of a couple of diseases that weren't even found really in turkeys until the late 2000s. So we've got this kind of mass of things that are all happening at the same time. And scientists like myself and a bunch of others, I got a good friend, Mike, at the University of Georgia that I work with. And it's not just us, there's a bunch of other scientists. And all of our state agency people are, I want to say, laser focused on this issue, trying to do what we can to basically increase female production. Because for turkeys, how many babies are made each year really is where the rubber meets the road, and I'd be risked to, we also have had, and I'll say this, and we also had across the landscape changes in our predator communities. Yes. We used to have wolves, for instance. Wolves would depress coyote populations. They would keep some of our smaller mesocarnivore, mesomammal populations down. We don't have them anymore. So what we've seen is an explosion in coyotes. Coyotes and bobcats, they don't particularly, coyotes aren't eating raccoons and possums or skunks that often. So we kind of have this weird predator dynamic that's also occurred. So we're facing a lot of challenges. But I don't want it to sound all gloomy and whatnot, because I mean, this is what I do is, my job is to work with my state agency partners who represent the people of their states to come up with answers to questions that we can use to kind of push science forward.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things involved here. And it's one of those situations that sounds like where we see the problem, we see potential issues that are probably all playing a role, and then it's teasing out what are the roles and which are the pieces that we can control most quickly so that we can stop the bleeding, basically, and then start moving forward and changing and adjusting as we go.
Absolutely. And that's a good point, because if you imagine a triage center, you need to fix the big gaping hole first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what, from a scientific perspective, we always try to do is, we can't manage predator communities per se, right? There's no, and I tell people this all the time, there's no possible mechanism to take all the things that might eat a turkey nest off of the landscape, right? The number one thing that eats a turkey nest is a snake, all right? I spend as much time in the woods as anybody because I love being in the woods. I hardly ever see snakes, and I'm out there constantly.
Yeah.
So to think that we'd like remove all the snakes or remove all the coyotes or all the foxes or all the whatevers and suddenly have more nest success doesn't particularly, it doesn't work. At the scale we need it to work at. It might work very well at a 500-acre piece of property, but it's not going to work at a place the size of Tennessee. Right.
No, and we don't want it to work because of everything that would entail after that, because they don't just eat turkey eggs or turkey. I mean, they're controlling so much else. So that's not a good option.
No, nature's a lot smarter than we are. We're just trying to wedge our little selves into it whenever we can. So, but it's fortunate that we have the ability to, as scientists and as a community, because the listeners may not recognize, but the turkey community is super tight knit, right? Mm-hmm. We all pretty much know everybody on a first name basis. Those of us that have been working with turkeys, we're very open. We love having everybody engaged. We've got brilliant scientists at different universities and disease ecologists and population dynamicists and graduate students that are out chasing turkeys all the time. And then you've got your brilliant state wildlife agency personnel, and every single state in the United States has a person whose sole job is to manage the upland wildlife in their state. And in some states, it may be just a guy or a girl whose job is to manage turkeys, like Raina Tile up in Missouri, or Jason Harden in Texas, or Cody Senatol here in Louisiana. Or maybe somebody who's got the entire upland game bird program over there. But they've got a person that thinks about this stuff all the time. And the nice thing about the kind of community of turkey biologists that's out there is that we're all interested in the same goal. And that goal is ensuring that everybody has wild turkeys in 2060 or 2080 whenever we're long gone. So that's why it's so much fun to work on. So and go out and chase them around and do the science on them all the time.
Oh yes, exactly. And you mentioned that turkeys are forest birds, but they're not just they need more than just the forests. And so
Absolutely.
Habitat is always a part of the answer. Whenever we're talking about wildlife management of any kind out there. And so one thing that I think a lot of people really don't realize is that good turkey habitat is also good pollinator habitat. It's good songbird habitat. It's good lots of other thing habitat. So it really all works together. So can you kind of describe some of the habitats that they need? Yes, forests, but forests can vary as to what that means, but then also some of those other types of habitats and resources that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna broadly generalize here. So,
Hmm.
if any of the listeners are like, well, that's not what I saw for a Gould's wild turkey in Arizona, I'm painting with a big paintbrush here.
Yes,
So
and most of our listeners are in the Eastern U.S. too,
right,
so that
right.
helps as
So
well.
yeah, so for most of you in the Eastern US, you'll be with me. So here's the first thing that I'll say. So turkeys don't smell very well. That's not what they're made for, right? I mean, you've seen
Hmm.
them. They don't have big nares, that kind of stuff. And turkeys have monocular periscopic vision, and they move their eyes. They don't have depth perception like we have it, with two eyes facing kind of forward. So the reason they bob their heads and switches their heads is because they're using that to measure distance. Turkeys have to be able to see. If they can't see, they're not going to go there. The number one thing, the number one issue that we have from a forest management perspective is that too often the understory in our forests creates a vegetative fence line that a turkey won't use. And it can be any number of species. It can be vines and blackberries and those type of things that are just so thick the bird won't walk through it.
Hmm.
To it can be woody vegetation, yaupon, those type of things that create basically a fence line. Like a turkey will walk up to a fence and will often not fly over it, but will turn left or right. And the question we're getting at here is the concept of usable space. Historically, all of our woodlands of any type, our pines, our upland hardwoods, our riparian hardwoods, all of them were generally, especially in the South, generally fire maintained, right? At some point,
Hmm.
stuff would burn off underneath and it would keep them kind of open. We've lost that to where we've moved into a more heavier, often canopy cover, but often a mid-story and an understory level that's not full of the grasses, the bunch grasses, and the herbaceous forbs that these birds like to use. And a lot of that has to do with, I don't want to say the lack of management, but the ability to put management on the ground. We do a pretty good job of putting management on the ground on our public lands. Think your national forest, your state wildlife management areas, and your state forest. Turkeys in their existence, though, is predicated on the use of private property. Most of the United States is private property where turkeys exist. So their continued existence is predicated on private property. And less active management often gets done on private property. Now, I'm a farm boy. I grew up in East Central Illinois with running cattle and pigs in the woods because they kept all the understory down. Well, at the time, I didn't think about it, but that also meant that there was different vegetation that could come up and critters could move through it a lot better. So when you think about usable space, part of every state agency's goal is to maximize the amount of usable space or habitat that's available. And we do, working with state agencies, National Wild Turkey Federation, our partners, we do a lot of science on public and private land to try and figure out what the birds are using. And you really get some neat stuff like how birds where they will take their poults after they hatch to go forage has a lot to do with how many insects are there. But it also has a lot to do with how hot it is outside. Because if it's 95 degrees and the humidity is like 130%, like it is in Louisiana every year, I'm kidding everybody. Those poults want to be someplace cool so that they can thermoregulate. If you've got a bird that predominantly lives on and forages on, hard mast in the fall, then you need your deciduous acorns and hickories and, beeches and all that stuff to provide that hard mast going in the fall and in the winter. So for turkeys as a general rule, they want to have an open kind of forested understory that they can move through and they can see, with the caveat that they really like to nest in kind of bushes or vegetation or low growing pine trees or, blackberry patches or blueberry patches where they can kind of nest up and hide, right? So you want to have a lot of diversity within the landscape. And this goes back to what you were talking about earlier. What's good turkey habitat is good pollinator habitat because you have flowers and, all the plants and the bees and hummingbirds and everything. It's also good for deer. It's also good for a huge array of songbirds and migratory passerines and non-migratory pasture. It's good for mice. It's good for your small mammal communities. In a lot of cases, the forested openings are hugely beneficial to bat species.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and bats are fantastic. And the community all generally works together. And what we try to do from my side of the table, because I don't get to set as many fires or do as much brush management as I want to do nowadays, is we try to create the information that both biologists that work for state and federal agencies, but also that private individuals who have 20 acres or 10 acres in their backyard. Like, I mean, I have 3 acres in front of my house that I burn every year, and it looks beautiful. I know you get turkeys in there all the time. We try to create the information so it's not just about managing 10,000 acres of national forest. It's what can you do on your 3 acres or your 2 acres or your 5 acres back behind your house, or get with your neighbors, because we have a woodland behind my house that's got a little riparian draw, and we're all kind of getting together to get rid of some of the junk that's back there and burn it and clean out some of the invasive species. So it's turkey, basically conservation rests on private landowners at a national level. And so we try to do as much as we can to get that information out to them such that they can do whatever they want to do. And people often say, I only have an acre, or I only have 3 acres. There's not much I can do. Maybe not. My mom and dad have about 47 feet in their backyard in Kentucky, but they have deer come through there every day because they've got a little itty bitty woodlot that is probably not 30 feet by 40 feet wide. And they come and hide their fawns there every spring. So my dad intentionally doesn't move any of the wood out of this little peninsula and just lets it all grow up, because that's where he knows the does are going to hide their fawn when they go out to feed at night. So it's those type of things that are useful. And that's the type of information from a turkey perspective we try to get out to our conservation partners and private landowners.
Yes. Which, going off of that, for our listeners who have a little bit of land, probably not a little lot in the middle of the city.
No, absolutely. Hey, I'm sitting in Baton Rouge. We do, martin nest boxes, hummingbird feeders. We catch bats in the middle of Baton Rouge. We have a faculty member here that catches owls, barred owls in urban environments and tracks them around. They totally use everybody's backyard. So, it's absolutely, maybe not specific to turkeys, but don't think that just because it's not a turkey, it's not important.
Oh, yeah, no, there are so many wildlife species, and it's always amazing how much wildlife you can find in the middle of a downtown major metropolitan urban area.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe not necessarily turkeys, but other species. But yeah, for those who have a little bit of land and are in these areas where the turkeys may be, what are some of those things that they can do to maybe help manage their land and make it better for turkeys?
Sure. So I'm a proponent of fire, and I understand that. And admittedly, it doesn't matter if you're east or west of the United States. Fire is important, but also there's a realistic side of this that you can't burn the 50 yards of woods behind your house, right? In some environments, and that's okay. But I think what it comes down to is if you can do anything in a small area, it's typically tied to getting rid of overly thick, heavy brush is what I'll call it. And if you can't walk through it, a turkey wouldn't use it. A lot of times those species are invasive and they're non-native. And by getting rid of those, you actually provide the added benefit of letting the native species that exist in the seed bank kind of come up. A lot of times I'll tell people that the probably the best thing they can do is remove the woody vegetation and run a mower through it every year or two and see what plants come up. Some people like to go out and disturb the soil in small areas, and I'm a big proponent of that as well, and do some soil disturbance and just let native species come in. And if you see something, we're not talking about thousands of acres. If somebody has a half acre behind their house, you can go walk it 20 minutes, right? Get rid of some of those non-native invasives, and that'll allow stuff to kind of come in. Some people don't like to use herbicides. As a professional scientist, sometimes I deal in landscapes where we do have to use them. That's a personal choice, but there are opportunities for going out and spraying to remove some of the woody component just to open it up a little bit. And that's really what it comes down to, is creating space the birds are comfortable to use. I'm not a proponent of feeding wildlife. I will say that. A lot of people like to, feeding a hummingbird is one thing. I should caveat this. So I have hummingbird feeders at the house. Feeding a hummingbird is one thing, but having a continuous supply of corn laying in your backyard is not really going to be useful for the species, other than for you to see them. You're better off to try and, manage for, having oak trees, so, whenever if you're going to plant trees in your backyard, instead of putting a red bud or a flowering dogwood, for instance, maybe you plant a red oak, or, a white oak or something like that. That's going to create mast and food for a variety of species. Those are some of the things I tell people, and I will say this, everybody's property is different. Everybody who owns land of any size is going to have different objectives with it. There are fantastic people that work at your local university and your local state wildlife agency. At the university, they're called extension associates, and their entire job is to work with the public, you all being the public, is to work with the public on land conservation and management issues, irrespective of how big it is. And then every state wildlife agency often has people who are kind of in the diversity program, is generally what it's called, and they have the same objective. What can they do to work with the local community to enhance conservation and management, irrespective of how big your piece of property is or what your objectives are? Sometimes my objectives are as simple as, I'm going to hang a couple of bird feeders and put black oil sunflower seeds in them because my daughter needs to do bird observations for a school class, right? Other times it's, we're going to go burn this area of hardwoods on the farm because I need to get rid of some, kind of thick woody understory. I work with those people as well to ensure that I'm maximizing what I can do. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I'd highly advise it. So, and if you don't have a backyard, go find a park or a public area next to you and go look around, because there's some of the most beautiful areas out there, and it's a really good chance to go and enjoy nature.
Oh, yes, exactly. And yes, I recommend to people all the time to talk to your extension agents. Every state has an extension service. So talk to your extension service agents. Your state Fish and Wildlife is a great place to go. The NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. There are a lot of resources out there, and you can go Google anything on habitat and find all the generic answers that you can. And those generic answers are often based off of research and based off of good generalities, but none of us have a general yard or property. They're all unique. They're all specialized. So how to apply those general pieces to our land, or what are the unique pieces that we need to pull out, can get lost in just those general recommendations that you find. So they play a role. I give them too. We talk about them. We're doing that now, but definitely if you're serious, dig in, get some of those specifics as well, and get that local help. It's always beneficial.
Yeah, the local people are great. I mean, I can speak for experience. The local people here at LSU that I work with are fantastic. One of them's office is right down the hallway from me, and she's awesome. And she goes out and does stuff everywhere from putting up bat boxes to working with landowners who don't want to go buy their flowers at, Home Depot. They want to put in a bed of native Louisiana flowers or whatever it is. And that kind of stuff all plays a role. So that's kind of what we try and do.
So is there anything else that we should talk about?
I guess the only other thing that I would generally bring up about turkeys, specifically, is that, we're in a really good place nationally when it comes to turkey conservation. We've got strong partners with our state wildlife agencies. I'll call it the turkey hunting community, which is amazingly enough is widespread, but also very, I don't want to say in good contact, but very aware of the situations that are going on, has taken a very proactive stance on conservation of this iconic species in the United States. Turkeys are one of those species they're ubiquitously us. They're ubiquitously a United States bird. They only exist in pretty much our country. You get a few in Canada. There's some birds in Ontario, but we don't claim them because they've crossed the northern border. There's birds in Mexico, in the Yucatan region, but they're ubiquitously us, and they're a legacy that I think that conservation and science can be proud of. And I mean, there's nothing more fun for me than just going out someplace where there are a bunch of turkeys and just watching them move and act, because they're a beautiful bird. Mm-hmm. And I mean, each subspecies is unique. Their coloration is gorgeous. The iridescent colors that they have on them, they're extremely vocal. They have, I think the last real count I've heard is some about 30 unique sounds, of which I'd argue I've only heard 3 or 4 of, and that's fine. But they're uniquely vocal, and they're really cool because most people think about birds as an animal that flies. And the only time a turkey flies is in the morning when it jumps down from the roost where it spent its night, or at night when it jumps up to the roost to go to bed, or maybe if it's being chased by something to escape. Other than that, they walk around all day long, which mm-hmm. means that their sight picture is effectively waist high on anybody for the entire day. And they're just an exciting, fun species to study and teach about and learn about. And, I've been studying for 20 years and I still learn something new every day. So it's fantastic. So.
Oh yeah. And they're so much fun to watch too. And they definitely pay attention and learn their landscape well. I mean, one of the funniest things I've seen with turkeys is shortly after we moved here, we moved some of the stepping stones that were in the backyard. And we'd had a flock of turkeys that came through every day, wandered around the backyard. The next day, the flock of turkeys come up and they're feeding in the backyard, and it's early in the morning. And we see them come up, and they came up in a line. And the first one stopped where the stepping stones had been. And they just like train wreck behind it almost as they all kind of piled up. And they all start looking at it, bobbing their head and trying to figure out what in the world's different. And my husband and I were eating breakfast and looking out the window, just cracking up laughing at them, because finally, after about 10 minutes of these things looking around, trying to figure out what had happened with these stepping stones, finally, one of them gets up the courage and tentatively fly hops over where it was.
Yep.
And then the next one kind of looks at it and kind of fly hops over, and they're running back and forth next to where it was, trying to figure out the line, like as if we'd put up a fence there. Mm-hmm. And finally, they all did that, got over, and then they kind of turn around, they're kind of looking at it, and we were cracking up laughing because it was absolutely hilarious watching these birds respond to what had just, we didn't even think was a major move at all or change.
Well, if your whole life is spent trying not to get eaten, you view everything with caution. And yes. And you're absolutely right. And that's a great story, because these birds turkeys have an acute sense of how things should be. And the reason that Franklin wrote his original statement on, being a bird of courage, right, is mm-hmm. that it was defending what it felt was its yard, right? And there was an intruder that was not a predator, but there was an intruder in its yard. And when something changes, they immediately responded. That's exactly what you saw. Mm-hmm. The sense of spatial acuity that these birds have, which is a fancy word for, knowing where things should be, is pretty amazing. So
yes.
They're a great bird, and I've been fortunate to spend a career working on them. I really have, and I've made some of my best friends and had some great students, just through this on the way. And the fact that I get the opportunity to sit down with you and just talk about turkeys for an hour or so is just fantastic. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for talking with us. This has been really fun and educational. So yes, thank you. And if Absolutely. People have questions about turkeys in general, or want to learn more about your research, because we really didn't even get a chance to dig into that, can they contact you?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a state employee. I work for the state of Louisiana. You can, if you use the Google, if you Google my name, Bret Collier, it will show up. It'll be the first hit. My email address is there. You can certainly send me an email. The only caveat that I say is I get about 400 or 500 a day. So I may not respond to you that day. I'm moderately active on social media. And my handle on Twitter and Instagram is Dr. Shortspur. It's DrShortspur, which, and so same on both. It was actually a joke whenever Twitter and Instagram came around that I created kind of a funny one because I only use it for work and I just put pictures of turkeys up and sciencey stuff. But you can follow me there if you want to. And then I'm on Facebook, and it's Bret Collier, the guy from Louisiana, I think is what my Facebook is. There's like a weird number. I think it's like 750, but I'm pretty noticeable on there. And again, it's all science-based. I don't do anything personal on any of my social media. So it's a good place to, follow stuff. And if you're generally just interested in wild turkey science, I will put this out there that one of my colleagues, Wild Turkey Doc, his name is Mike, every Tuesday he does a post on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram about kind of the science that he and I do together. And it's great. And he's at the University of Georgia, and he kind of handles that. And it's basically just a short blurb about something sciencey about turkeys every week. Today's was on the roosting habitats of Gould's wild turkeys in Arizona. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you can certainly, find him on all the social medias and follow along there. And pretty much that's a brief non-scientific outlet for most of the science that we do. We try and put some of it up there about every week as well. So yeah, but feel free. Like I said, I'm an employee of the state, so I answer everybody's email whenever they have them, even if they're not in my state. So if there's any questions, bring them along. And if I don't know the answer, I'll either lie to you and tell you I do, or I'll direct you to your state wildlife agency person that will have the answer specific to you.
Yes, that's great. And thanks for the resources too. I'll provide links to everything you just talked about in the show notes so that it's really easy for people to find. You don't have to try and worry about scribbling it all down or remembering it. Just go to the show notes for this episode and it will all be there. Yeah, this has been, like I said, really great. So thanks a lot for talking with us and have a great day.
Thanks for having me. You have a good day too.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye. I appreciate Bret taking time to talk with us today. Wild turkeys are such fascinating birds, and their conservation success story is one that I believe should be remembered. I also think that Bret brought up a very important point when he said that wild turkey conservation is dependent on private landowners. That really is true, not just for wild turkeys, but for so many other species as well. It's easy to think that we can't really make a difference with our little piece of land, but that's not true. Some species may need more land than others, but we can all make a difference with our own properties. And as more people work towards similar goals, our properties may become part of a bigger network of wildlife and pollinator habitat, instead of just an isolated island that ends at our own property lines. That's why I think it is important to recognize and remember that many different species will use the same types of habitat. So managing your habitat for wild turkeys can also support pollinators, and vice versa. Before I wrap this up, I would like to ask a favor of you. If you find the Backyard Ecology content valuable, please consider supporting us. You can support us on Patreon or by making a one-time donation. Find out more at www.backyardecology.net/join-us, or just click on the button at the end of the show notes. And until next time, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.